And so, again, we've done this for a number of customers. We have 4 here. First is a healthcare organization where we, again, monitoring those endpoints. We monitored 30,000 endpoints for compliance. The second is a large bank. Again, with the fraud components, we had prevented $60 million in fraud clearly identified in the first year. Another international bank that reduced their investigation time for incidents by 99%. This goes from months to minutes, right, with the approach. And a credit card processing company that working for their banking clients proactively identified threats at 16,000 clients, right, as end users, right? Okay, next theme, protecting our critical assets. All right, so first, what is a critical asset? Right. So the critical assets are those things that provide most of the differentiation for your business or provide the things that your business can't survive without, the information that you absolutely have to operate, right? Or the loss of which would be a significant blow to the profitability and survival of the business, right? In order to protect those assets, we first have to identify what they are. We have to change our approach to how we manage them. We have to manage that security risk on an active basis, right? And we need to manage and secure the network and endpoints, as we just said. All right, so there's 4 factors or viewpoints or vectors that we look at when we're securing these assets. So the first of it is the identity and access. So we have these assets, people have access to them. So you want to know who has access to which assets, right? It's part of identity management, and we've had identity management for a long time. Problem with 20th century identity management is that it's fairly static and it's fairly siloed, right? We need to have a much more real-time view of who's got access to what data. And that's the key to that is really a governance life cycle and intelligence about the identities. Managing that life cycle is critical. Next point about identity management that you need to focus on is privileged users, right? So those are users who've got elevated privileges, root access on a system, or access to change logs, or access to install or delete application code, right? Those people can do bad things. You know those people, they're not likely to do bad things. It happens occasionally, but that's fairly rare. What's more likely is that those persons' credentials are compromised and a bad person uses a good person's credentials. So managing those credentials is critical. It's important, it's easier to manage a smaller number of credentials. So the smaller the number of privileged user credentials you have, the easier the job becomes. On the access side, we have some other new problems, right? The first is federation, and adaptive access control. So in the past, we've always created the IDs for the organization. We were the source of the identities. That's not always true today. There's a lot more federated identities where we're trusting an ID that comes from a different source, whether the source is Google or a partner, business partner, or a third party, right, or a government source, right? But those federation activities are much more difficult for us to manage because we don't own the IDs, right? And then we have application content protection. Again, on smartphones and mobile, that's quite a bit more difficult today. And we have higher expectations around authentication and single sign-on, right? So we have some challenges in the areas of identity that are critical in terms of protecting our data, right, from a data approach, right? Right. The next, and this is the core of this theme, is that we need to identify and protect the sensitive data, right? So how do you do that? So the first is you've got to identify it. We have to figure out where it is, what it is, where it lives, right? Where it's stored. has always been viewed as a difficult problem because we have so much data. We have terabytes, petabytes of data in IBM, right? And figuring out what's critical for a business has been a difficult problem. What we've discovered, though, is that not much of the company data is critical. It's actually a very small percentage. So it makes the job a little bit easier. Excuse me. Once we've identified the data, we need to take a look at where it's stored and assess vulnerabilities on those systems. Typically databases, right? But not always. Right? So as I'll show you in a couple of minutes, some of the places that we store data, right, are not necessarily databases, and they're a little difficult for us to manage. But we want to identify where the data is, and we want to know what the vulnerabilities are. So the vulnerabilities for those systems are typically the vulnerabilities that we know for those databases, and we want to know where they are, right? Once we've identified those, we want to start to harden those repositories, right? And that takes two key methodologies. The first is encryption, right? And the second one is masking. Right, so we need to encrypt the data. We don't want to encrypt all of the data in the organization. We can't. Nobody can afford that in terms of either money or CPU cycles. We want to archive and purge dormant data or bad data because it costs money to encrypt this. There's no point in encrypting data we don't need. And we want to get rid of dormant entitlements because that goes back to the users again and people who've got access that don't need it. Right? Once you've done that, you need to monitor the access to the critical data in a more comprehensive way than you monitor access to other data sets, right? You need to keep an eye on it all the time, right? You particularly want to look at identifying suspicious activity, right, and producing compliance reports for the critical data over and above the compliance reports that you do for regulatory information like SOX or PCI, right? And then, obviously, protection, right? We're going to prevent unauthorized access and enforce the change control in the systems. These are things we know how to do, right? But what we want to do here is apply them to this critical data set, right? The next factor we have vector on this is to manage the application security risks. So we got people, we got data, and we got applications that access the data. So those applications also have to be managed, right? And primarily this means that the applications need to be tested, right, to make sure that their life cycle for application development is a secure life cycle, that they're constantly being tested for security vulnerabilities during their development and during their change control process, right? And we take a variety of methods to doing that. We use dynamic application scanning. We're doing that against production applications. We do static code testing against applications, both before they're deployed and while they're in development, right? And we do application security management with active attempts to compromise applications as well. All three of those approaches are necessary to be successful in the activity, right? And then finally, right, we want to fortify and manage the endpoints wherever they exist. So those endpoints we talked about earlier, but particularly the endpoints that use your critical information. So I told you earlier that typically the critical information is not a large percent. IBM finds that somewhere between 1/100th of 1% and 2% of all the data in the company. And it typically falls into about 4 categories, but legal information, particularly around acquisitions and divestitures. Corporate strategy information is critical. Financial information prior to its public release falls in that category. And then there's a set of information around compliance activities that sometimes falls in that set. Now, it's not a lot of information, but frequently, that information is stored on systems that are not our most secure, like email, right? So your board may be sharing information with email. Your attorneys may be sharing information on email. They may be putting information on thumb drives and passing them around, and they may be using information that's not encrypted, right? Because it generally falls outside of your control areas. So you need to, in the strategy, you need to look at where that critical data lives, right, and then apply appropriate controls to that specific data set, right? All right, for the endpoints, if your CEO's laptop is a data store for critical information, it needs to be managed to make sure it's compliant. Right, you need to spend extra care managing those endpoints, including those executives' PCs, right, that have critical data on them. It's just as critical as managing your Oracle databases or your DB2 databases. And a lot of this, again, is basic information, basic hygiene, right? We quarantine infected endpoints. You make sure your virus software is up to date. You take a look at the software usage, right? You block malicious communication processes. You don't want phishing attempts to get you to your Cs, right? You don't want them to get to the CEO. You don't want them to get to your CISO. The guys click on anything, right? You don't want it to happen, right? You want to make sure the malware is removed, right? And again, from my IAM point of view, you really want to protect the credentials of those people who have access to the critical information, right? So that needs extra attention, right? And the easiest way to do that is with endpoint management that you can monitor. All right, so business cases again, protecting critical assets. For IBM, we had a large food and beverage company, beer, right? That saves 65% managing these critical assets in the first 3 years of operation, right? A computer services company reduced their code vulnerabilities by 33% using the application scanning and testing tools. Global financial companies saved $21 million in compliance cost, right, using the compliance monitoring tools and the real-time monitoring. And then we had a healthcare team that increased their patching success rates by 50% just in the management. All right. This next activity is our last and shortest as well. But it's to safeguarding the cloud and mobile. So cloud and mobile have been, in my view, the two biggest changes to our environment, our activities in security in the last 30 years, right? Most of the time I've been doing security. And the changes are really twofold. So the first is on cloud. We no longer have direct access to the systems where our data and applications live. So our approach to securing that data and those applications has to be changed, has to modify. Some of that, you have to put some level of trust in your cloud provider or the cloud that you create. Some of that, you just have to change your approach, right? But it's a big difference, right? And as cloud becomes more prevalent, a larger and larger percentage of this critical data, right, in our important applications move outside of our direct control. And the second, which I think is even a larger set, is mobile. So 40 years ago, we built all our own applications. Your teams wrote them as well, right? We moved away from that into first in client server and then into web systems. And applications were server side, right? We had control over them. We had control over the channels, right? We were able to encrypt those channels. That's really shifted in the last 3 or 4 years with smartphones and mobile. Right, we're now back in the application development business. We have to write apps for iOS. We have to write apps for Android. Right, those apps get sent out. People write apps that use our data. Surprise, surprise. Right, that we didn't know about. Right, so we have many different entry points into our data sets than we used to. We don't own those endpoints anymore. These aren't terminals, under the mainframe. They're not PCs that we bought. There are customers' smartphones. There are competitors' smartphones, right, using our systems and our data. We have to be able to come up with an approach that protects our systems even when we don't have absolute control over these endpoints and the data sets, right? And that's a huge, huge difference for us. So how do we do that, right? So the first goal is to gain cloud visibility and control. Right? We know we have a cloud, but do we have insight and visibility into the cloud set, right? So whether the cloud is public or hybrid or a private cloud, it's all the same in my view, right? We have employees who bring their own devices. We've got on-premises equipment and we've got mobile, right? Out in the wild, we've got customers who are using our apps. We've got non-customers who are using our apps. We have approved apps, right, that we may be creating and sending out, but it's not the only channel in, it's not the only vector, right? So the strategy that we have to come up with, right, is a way to detect who's using the data, who's using the resources that we have, right? So we need discovery and visibility into the cloud data sets. We need to understand what the connections are, the identity and access. Who are these people who are accessing our systems and using the data? Right? Again, in the old days, right, we created all those user IDs. Today, we may not be doing that. Right? So I submit that we still need a source of record for what those IDs are, even if we're not creating them. Right? I'm an old directory guy. Right? Beyond detection and connection, right, we need to protect, right? So the data's in the cloud. We still have the possibility, the probability of incidents. We need to be able to correlate those incidents with our on-premise equipment, with our on-premises data. We need to apply the same types of threat protection approaches, right, to that data in the cloud that we do to our internal data and our internal sets. And we need to have security policies, right, that go beyond our internal data and into cloud data as well, right? And those policies need to be cloud aware, right? Because again, we don't have the same access into those clouds that we did into the things that we built for ourselves. Honestly, this is a more difficult problem, right? So of all the things that I've talked about today, this tends to be the most difficult to do in practice, right? Second problem, again, that I mentioned was the mobile security, right? So mobile applications and smartphones give us a much more difficult set of problems than we've had to deal with in the past. Some of those problems are old problems, return, in application development, but some of them are radically new because we don't own the devices anymore. All right. So what we're looking for here is an approach that goes from the data that we have internal, right, to a seamless, scalable, and complete view of how that data and resources are being accessed, right? So we need to be able to manage this multi-operating system, bring your own device environment, right? It would be nice if, right, people only used approved apps when they were accessing our resources, right? So how do we do that? So how do we manage those endpoints? So can we install code at the endpoint? Will our customers allow us to download some code that manages the security of their device, or at least alerts us to insecure activity occurring on the device, a jailbroken phone or a phone that's now been compromised with malware? Right? So we have ways we can do that. The biggest problem is getting the customer acceptance. We want to separate enterprise and personal data, both on devices that are used, right? I mean, I do that by using two phones. I don't know how many of you do that, but I have a company phone and a personal phone. Most people don't do that, right? So separating that corporate data from personal data becomes more difficult if it's on a single device on a single operating system. So it's a bigger problem for us. We want to go back to the application development paradigm or system where we develop applications, test the applications for security, and then distribute them. This time we're distributing the customers. The difficulty here is that our cycle time is far, far faster than it was 2 decades ago. We could put a new release out on a smartphone application every few weeks, right? Maybe every 3 or 4 days, right? There's a new code release, right? A new patch update. That's the expectation, right? Every time one of those releases goes out, it needs to have been tested and scanned, right? And approved and signed. The code needs to be signed again, right? So the scale of the operation and the rapidity of the operation needs to change as well. So this is an application development activity that occurs on a line of business, but it involves you, right? You're the security team. You need to provide the leadership and the guidance to the business to make sure that they're providing applications to the customers that in fact are secure, right? It's a difficult job for you, right? We need to provide secure web API access, identify the device risk, and let our business owners know what the risk is that they're running. So they make the final decision about whether they're going to release an app or not, right? You know, I want it out by December 1 for Christmas selling. You know, it's going to go out whether it's ready or not, right? They make the decision, but you need to provide the leadership to tell them this is what the vulnerability is, this is what your potential risk is, right? We need to extend our security intelligence into these mobile applications. They need to be part of what we monitor, right? Even though they're not our devices, they're our applications, right? So you need to make sure that that information is coming into your security event center as well, right? So the easiest way to do that is into your security information event monitoring system platform, or SIEM. But you also need to incorporate mobile log management and activity detection in as well, right? So this is nearly as difficult of a problem as the cloud problem, right? And it's new for us in this century, in this era. All right, for this case, we've got a couple of things. This customer on the left I actually worked for 2 years to install this. We've got a large auto manufacturer, 8.5 million. Most of those are customers, global. There's about 400,000 of those that are employees that use their own devices, union employees. So we were able to install this system that provided secure access for both this customer set and for this employee set, right? We did this with a cloud system using cloud security tools. The second one, another customer I worked on, a global bank, we worked with them to provide multi-factor authentication and secure application development for mobile access for millions of banking customers globally. I think we're around 36 million banking customers the last I looked for this one. All right, so that's what I have for you today. Again, I really appreciate your attendance and bearing with me for the English as well. Thank you.